Dear friends, thank you for all attending. Today is August 4th, 2020, the second day of our retreat in place. And we will start by two wonderful sutras, the Metta Sutra, also called the Sutra on Love, and the Sutra on Happiness. So I'm wondering if we have volunteers, I can share screen both of those. If I could have two volunteers to read the sutras, to read the Metta Sutta. So if I could have two volunteers, you can either try to raise your hand, then I might see you, but I might not. If you toggle under participants, you can click the little thing that says raise hand as well. So I'm looking for two volunteers to read this sutra. Anyone? Cornelia, thank you. And Paul, thank you.
And which one did you want first, Paul?
The Metta Sutta, which,
Okay.
Oh dear, do you have that copied? Because I don't even have it on my share screen thing. Do you guys have it, copies?
I do.
Cornelia, do you?
I don't. Is it in that brown book?
It is in the brown book, yes, but.
Let me see if I can find it. I did not.
Well, wait 1 second here. I'm going to pause the recording. I think I can get this up. All right. And I think I can have it on my share screen now. Sorry about that. Or maybe not. Oh, well. Cornelia, if you could just read the first half and then Paul read the second half. Thanks.
Discourse on love. He or she who wants to attain peace should practice being upright, humble, and capable of using loving speech. He or she will know how to live simply and happily, with senses calmed, without being covetous and carried away by the emotions of the majority. Let him or her not do anything that will be disapproved of by the wise ones. And this is what he or she contemplates. May everyone be happy and safe, and may all hearts be filled with joy. May all beings live in security and in peace, beings who are frail or strong, tall or short, big or small, invisible or visible, near or far away, already born or yet to be born. May all of them dwell in perfect tranquility.
Let no one do harm to anyone. Let no one put the life of anyone in danger. Let no one, out of anger or ill will, wish anyone any harm. Just as a mother loves and protects her only child at the risk of her own life, we should cultivate boundless love to offer to all living beings in the entire cosmos. Let our boundless love pervade the whole universe, above, below, and across. Our love will know no obstacles. Our heart will be absolutely free from hatred and enmity. Whether standing or walking, sitting or lying, as long as we are awake, we should maintain this mindfulness of love in our own heart. This is the noblest way of living. Free from wrong views, greed, and sensual desires, living in beauty and realizing perfect understanding, those who practice boundless love will certainly transcend birth and death.
Dear friends, it is just wonderful to be here with you today. I want to begin by mentioning that words fail me. And by that I mean I am here trying to instill or transmit the wonderful ideas that happen that are called the Four Noble Truths. And the way I do this is with words. And we all know that words can be inaccurate and clumsy and may not always transmit the way I really feel about this. So I'm telling you, I'm doing my best with this, but I realize that everything might go a little bit differently from everyone else. In the fourth mindfulness training, when, as Jeremy mentioned yesterday, that talks about right speech, that we wish to have words that instill confidence, joy, and hope. And this is what I really wish to do. I wish to have ways that I can give you confidence, joy, and hope. I am confident that every single one of you can wake up, that every single one of you can participate in this thing called enlightenment, peace of mind, happiness, whatever you want to call it. And that I believe that when the Buddha was teaching, he expected that this would be a common thing, not an uncommon thing. So I wish that everyone could have this particular experience. And the way that you do that is to practice. So in the midst of giving lots of individual information on this particular talk, in the way of trying to transmit this wonderful feelings that I have, the fondness that has and how it has illuminated my life, the Four Noble Truths, I'm hoping to inspire you to practice. It's always nice that we get together, and of course, especially in the Plum Village tradition, words have a specific reverence to them. We do a lot of Dharma sharing, we do a lot of those sorts of things. But what I really hope to do is to get you to really practice and take these to your heart rather than trying to put it into your brain. In this way, this is the way that we practice the Four Noble Truths, is by having them be alive for us. So I just want to get my notes here. I want to start out just by talking about words which will, of course, trip us up a little bit as we go along. Much of it, for those, especially those of you who speak more than one language, you realize that words can be a little bit inaccurate and clumsy. And although it's not the entire source, one of the things that we have when we take these wonderful teachings that were written in odd languages such as Pali and Sanskrit or ancient Chinese, that these words are obviously going to be different depending on who translates it. And we're somewhat at the whim of 19th century British anthropologists, who were some of the people that first discovered a lot of these things. The British actually decided in the 19th century that if they were going to conquer someone, they should know something about their way of life. So the British anthropologists weren't necessarily just there as, scientists. They were there to actually kind of find good ways to subjugate people. Nevertheless, they were there and they started with that. And so therefore, we have lots of terms that are a little bit difficult to translate into English. As an example, I think one of the ones that's most easy for people to see that there's a difficulty with is the word Dharma. We use the word Dharma a lot, and anybody who's been at the center or has been following us on Zoom or anything for more than a couple of months kind of gets a feel for Dharma. It sort of means the teachings, but maybe not really that. It sort of means a way of life, but not exactly that either. And so Dharma has this particular feeling that doesn't translate into English really well. And thus it is with a lot of the things that are going on in the Four Noble Truths. So the first thing that people usually have that talk about the Four Noble Truths, if you ask your garden variety Buddhist on the street, the first noble truth is that life contains suffering. And it's certainly certainly is a truth. I like the idea of actually looking at it more as a natural law than truth, which Jeremy mentioned yesterday, how the idea of even the idea of noble truth is a difficult thing to translate. But we have this thing called dukkha. Dukkha is the one thing that things are translated from, and it's usually translated as suffering. But it's more like an idea of unease or unsatisfactoriness. When we talk about these natural laws, incidentally, we're talking about them and how all of these Four Noble Truths go for us. We are taking it from the experience of being a human being and different than sort of other animals. I mean, I don't want to lend short shrift to the way animals experience life. So we know that animals, for example, experience many of the emotions that we experience very deeply. So that we know many animals, for example, experience grief at the loss of a companion. There's also now that we have wonderful machines like functional MRI scanners, we can find out that, for example, one odd fact, that dogs have a default mode network. For those who are unaware, and it's not important that you know anything about the default mode network, you've heard a lot in our teachings about dropping the storyline. Well, the storyline comes from our default mode network, and guess what? The dogs have one. So dogs have a storyline. Isn't that interesting? You know, you wonder if your dog's not behaving well, that you should tell them to drop the storyline, but they can't particularly do that way. And there's also a wonderful book, and actually a wonderful author who's written several good books by the name of Robert Sapolsky, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And in his story about why zebras don't get ulcers is, he has this story about a zebra who is being chased by a lion. And he's a little bit faster, he's a little bit more sure-footed, but he really needs to keep getting ahead of the lion. So he follows this way and that way and tries to cover his tracks and tries to get through little valleys and through little, areas that are kind of stony or difficult or narrow for the lion to give up. And if the zebra is successful and the lion gives up, 30 seconds after this is done, the zebra's back to munching his grass or doing whatever he was. He's just done with it. And that's not us. What we do is we keep our concern going on and on and on. And we are the only animals that think about, at least we believe we're the only animals that think about the future. Not just the future as to what's going to happen in the next 30 minutes, but the future of what's going to happen in the next 30 days, 30 years, or 30 millennia. We're constantly having this kind of thing. And this is definitely something that kind of leads us to having suffering or unsatisfactoriness. So we can't drop it ourselves. We tend to go on with it again and again. And this idea of unsatisfactoriness and suffering is often looked at as an inevitable thing, a natural law, and it really is. If we have the capacity to think about the future and to plan, we are going to have perhaps an excessive amount of worry and difficulty. And people have talked in evolutionary psychology about why the worrying hunter-gatherer was a better person than the non-worrying hunter-gatherer, although I have some kind of issues with that. So the word that came up that the Buddha used, although we don't really know if the Buddha used it, it's basically been translated into Pali, is dukkha. Dukkha means suffering. We'll often call it that. There were a couple of wonderful translations done that yesterday. The idea of unease. So sometimes we think of suffering as being this great, gigantic burden. And of course, when great difficulties come into our lives, yes, of course they are a problem. So a bad diagnosis, the death of a loved one, divorce, difficulties with your employment, difficulties with your children, general frictions that happen here and here, these big time capital S sufferings, of course, these occur. But a little bit more of that is this kind of idea about a misfit between what's happening and what our mind wants to happen. So it's more like 1,000 little paper cuts that occur rather than the big sledgehammer that hits you over the head. So you, as an example, let's say you're, before the pandemic occurred, you could go out to dinner. You're going out to dinner with your partner, and he or she is wearing that really ugly green shirt. You don't like that green shirt. You have this feeling of unease. It doesn't fit. And there are, of course, a lot of things going on with that in a lot of ways that you might try to solve that problem. You might ask your partner, do you really need to wear that shirt? Which you might get into an argument about. Or you might try to accept it on your own and see how things go. But it's a misfit. It's an unease. It is a difficulty that just arises because it doesn't fit your particular moment. It doesn't fit the way that you think the world should be. And this happens all the time. I mean, the ideas about, bad diagnoses and bad things happening in our lives with our family and our health and everything else are certainly occurring. But mostly the kinds of things that the Buddha is talking about when he talks about unease is this misfit, is this idea that something is a little bit wrong. It doesn't have to be a big wrong. And we don't like it. And we don't like it. And of course, we often seek for solutions outside of ourselves. We think of solutions about, I gotta tell that person they should be wearing that mask. Or I should let them know that there's a law that says you have to do that. These kinds of things are going on. I want to do one thing on a share screen here. And this is, so this is a translation that is a little bit different than the one that Jeremy talked about yesterday, but it's similar. It's I decided I didn't know what to say about calling dukkha. So I said birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, sickness is dukkha, death is dukkha. Encountering what is not dear is dukkha. Separation from what is dear is dukkha. Not getting what one wants is dukkha. And in short, these 5 bundles of, that should be clinging, not cleaning. I have problems sometimes with my dictation dragon. And all of these things are there, including, so yesterday, the translation that came through by Glenn Wallace, who was a wonderful, wonderful author, was that death and sickness are unsettling, which is a kind of an understatement, isn't it? Death is unsettling. Yeah, I would guess it's a little bit unsettling. And in one way, I like that is the idea that settling is something that we do with meditation. The idea of whenever we sort of do our sitting meditation in that old kind of translation that Thai has for this is this idea that you're like a glass of apple juice with all the pulp in it, and it settles to the ground, settles to the bottom. You're settling. That's part of our meditation. And that things like death and sickness and those sorts of things being unsettling is something that perhaps is opposite of that. Or perhaps what I want to say is that, in the words of Larry Ward, a wonderful Dharma teacher in the Plum Village tradition, we are living constantly in this thing called survival physiology. We're always looking for the survival of this organic creature. And we see worries and fears perhaps more than we can and than we should. We over monitor, we over worry, we have a lot of those kinds of things. One other thing, Jeremy mentioned it yesterday, and I wanted to mention it also again, was these things that are called the 5 skandhas. I'm sorry if I'm doing a lot of individual lists and everything, but they're kind of interesting. And the 5 skandhas, also called aggregates or heaps, once again, the difference between the translations is always a problem. These things are, just because we have them, they are suffering. So form, just because we have this physical form is suffering, unless, of course, some magical thing happened where the entire world fit according to you. Even then you probably would have suffering. So my favorite one of the 5 skandhas, and one that I like to think is very worthwhile to work on, is called Vedana, often called feelings. And feelings here is not like an emotion as much as a preference. The feeling of I like this or I don't like this is something that comes, and it's extraordinarily quick and very automatic. One of the wonderful things about living in this modern era, especially after they've done a lot of this kind of physiologic research, is we can determine that certain things occur very quickly and automatically. It's definitely part of that idea of natural law. And one of the quickest things that happens to us whenever we have an event that our senses take in, part of the form is the 5 senses, maybe the 6th sense is, of course, mind, is like versus dislike. It happens extraordinarily quickly. As a matter of fact, it happens before you even know what it is. We know that this kind of thing goes on. So we have an immediate kind of dis-ease or ease of something right away. It isn't even as if we have a chance to choose that. We just have that. That happens very, very quickly. Perceptions, and we all know how difficult they can be. And those people who are students of Thai, of Thich Nhat Hanh, who are in the Plum Village tradition, know that he has frequently said, with perception, there is deception. In other words, because of the way our past actions have been, our habit energies, Vedana itself, we almost never get a pure perception of things. And this is interesting, and we don't always know how we misperceive, but it's important to kind of know that we misperceive. Mental formations, which are usually closer to what is emotions. I wrote in there, this is what Stephen Batchelor wrote in his book. He calls them inclinations, and that they are the kinds of emotions such as anger and fear and worry, as well as emotions such as joy and love and even mindfulness. So mental formations occur as well. And because we have those, we are prone to this dukkha. We are prone to unsatisfactoriness. When we have, when something arises that causes us to have anger, we always have anger if the conditions are sufficient, just because we have mental formation. And of course, consciousness, being aware of what goes on with all of that. So those are the big things that happen in our existence, in the five skandhas, just because of who they are, just because of being a human being. There's going to be a lot of unsatisfactoriness, a lot of dis-ease, a lot of being the square peg trying to fit into the round hole. This is our life. This is how it goes. One other thing that we do very frequently that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about very frequently, but other teachers as well, is the second arrow. He has actually two analogies of arrows that I both like. The first of which is if you get shot with an arrow and then have a second arrow hit right on top of it, the discomfort is not doubled, it's more like 10 times as great. And he talks about this as being shot by an arrow as being the sort of ordinary pain and difficulties that happen in our lives. Let's talk about something that I frequently talk about in my class. Sorry if those of you in my class have heard this before, but if you step on a nail, you will have discomfort. Even if you're a really good practitioner and are very good with mindfulness, you will have discomfort. You will not be stepping on the nail saying, oh yes, I feel the sensation of the nail coming through my skin. I am really, no, you will have immediately that reaction, that vedana, so to speak, I don't like this, and this pain going on. And this is inevitable, and this happens, and this is just part of being an organic creature traveling on the surface of this planet. But the second arrow is the thing that usually does us in. So you step on the nail, and there's a whole lot of categories where you can go that can add to your suffering, to your disease, to your unsettling. The first of which is you could start doing this self-denigration. Oh, I'm so stupid. How could I even see that nail? I should have worn thicker shoes. I didn't. And do I have a tetanus shot done? Like, I don't even know if I've had a tetanus shot recently. And what is tetanus anyway? I might get locked. What is that? I just don't even know what that's about. Or you start being, start blaming the other parts of the universe. Who put that nail there? How could they be so inconsiderate? Don't they know that people could step on that and get lockjaw? And you kind of go that way instead of just kind of turning on this and sort of seeing it for what it is. It's a mere event. It's an event that happened. And we don't need to go to the next thing, the second part, which is the second arrow. This clearly, I mean, for many of you who notice this is the second arrow. There's another analogy that the Buddha uses about arrows, which I really like as well, which, again, gets to me to the idea that our practice is most important. A man is shot with a poison arrow, and he decides he wants to know all about this poison arrow. He wants to know what exactly is the poison. What kind of wood was the arrow made? There's feathers. Where did the feathers come from? Who was the man who shot him? What are his political views? Exactly, what distance was he shooting from? What kind of string did he use on his bow? And he's not going to have anything done until he knows all that. And this obviously is the way a lot of us also function, especially those of us who have had a lot of intellectualization in our lives. We have this idea that you have to know everything about everything before you can deal with it. While the quite simple thing is, get the poison arrow out, get some healing done, get some things going on along those. So we live in the survival physiology. We live in this idea of shooting ourselves with the second arrow all the time. We're kind of doing this. But dis-ease, the idea, unease rather, and unsatisfactoriness and unsettledness is always going to happen. This is a natural law. This is the first noble truth. It's not an optional thing. We can't say that suffering is caused by something that we can avoid. This is it. All right, you signed up for this life. This is what you got. But we don't have to stay there. And we're going to talk the next couple of days about looking at this deeply and seeing what it's about. But the first thing is to realize that just being aware that this happens and that it's no one's fault and it is not a failure of you in any way that you have this unease, that you have this unsettledness, that you have this dukkha. This is part of it. However, given the idea that dukkha has occurred, you now have choices. Do you want to increase your dukkha by shooting a second arrow? Do you want to get involved in fear and worry? I think the term that Stephen Batchelor uses a lot, and not just him, people in modern psychology use a lot, is reactivity. So reactivity, we react. We see that we have this kind of thing, and we go back to our survival mode, that survival physiology. We have the adrenaline pumping, our central nervous system going a certain way, and we follow it. For those people who are followers of Pema Chodron, you recognize this as Shenpa. Shenpa, there it is, boom. The thing occurs and we decide to make it worse, essentially, to cause more suffering by our fear, our worry, or just not accepting. I don't like the green shirt. I'm sorry, I don't like the green shirt. I can't do anything about it, but I don't like it. So having that kind of come about. We can do something about it, and again, that's the next 3 talks about this, exactly what we can do about it. But the first thing is just to accept it. There are 4 tasks involved, besides just what the statement of the 4 noble truths are. And Stephen Batchelor in his book likes to make it really clear that people don't talk about the 4 tasks. And the first task is dukkha is meant to be comprehended, meaning we are meant to understand that this natural law occurs. It's not personal and it's not someone's fault. Here it is. Dukkha is occurring. There it is. That's the very first thing. Turning, you've heard this, I think, many times, turning towards our afflictions rather than away from them. That it is meant to be observed, comprehended. This is the practice, getting involved with it, not turning away, not turning and blaming someone else, not blaming the universe, not blaming the way our body is put together or our mind is put together, just to kind of absolutely observe the dis-ease, the unease, the unsettlement, the dukkha, the suffering. There's also a term that is commonly used if you're starting out on the Buddhist path. And it is called the stream entry. So if you start reading some of these really wonderful sutras, they're very old, and the language, just like the sutra we read yesterday, was a little odd. But they really have some wonderful wisdom in them. And they often talk about the person who is called a stream enterer, the person who has decided to take on this path. But the thing that I think people don't know about the stream is the stream and where you want to get to, for most of us, is upstream. It's not flowing downstream. We have to almost swim against it. We are so ingrained by this organic body, the five skandhas, to be that reactivity, to keep going with it. This is the way that the majority of people live, that we don't realize that we don't have to have that choice, that we can do something different. But we swim upstream. It's not a downstream thing. We are constantly engaging and battling a bit with our sort of organic nature that expects us to suffer, that expects us to react out, to act out, to be invested in our anger and fear, in our righteousness. There was a famous 19th century American politician by the name of Henry Clay, who never got to be president, even though he was a very well-known person. And he would said, "I would rather be right than president." There are many people who have kind of had a little bit different take on that, which is, I would rather be right than happy. So no matter what, we live in our righteousness. This is the way it should be. I don't like that the world isn't according to Paul. I have to have it that way. I'm upset. And in that way, we kind of suffer. So a lot of this is what we'll talk about tomorrow. Exactly what is the origin of all of this? And what can we do about that in the third and fourth one? We'll talk a little bit more about this. The idea of acceptance. But the first thing I want to let people is this dukkha, this unease, this unsettling, this suffering is to be comprehended, is to be embraced, is to be turned around and accepted. That's the very first step on all of this. So dukkha happens. No way around it. That's just the way it is. Or I want to also quote one of my very favorite Buddhist philosophers, Rosanna, who says, it's always something. It's always something. So thank you very much for your attention today. And I could go on here, but maybe I thought this would be a good time to take any questions, or people have any comments about the talk at all. So if the best way, you can try to bow in and I'll try to see you, but if you toggle under participants and can click the raise hand thing, that might be a little bit better. So are there questions or comments or anything about the talk as we've done it so far? Ro?
Thank you so much, Paul. That was wonderful. I'm wondering, what is the difference between embracing dukkha and accepting it as a natural law that it is, and then, or this notion that we're not supposed to be swimming downstream or joining the flow, but in fact going against it. You know, so I mean, I guess that there's that sense of, on the one hand, if I have to accept it, then I would just like get in the river and flow, and in whatever direction it was going, I'd accept. Whereas if I'm actually having to go upstream, I mean, I understand on some level the concept, but I'm also just trying to get to the deeper, you know, because in some way swimming upstream itself is a reactivity.
Yeah.
You know, it's reacting to the flow that is just the nature that is coming toward me. Like on the one hand, I'm going to accept the nail in my foot, but I must pull it out because I'm not going to go. I mean, that's going upstream, right? It's pulling it out.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't. Just like
Thank you, Ro.
I just like the conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a very good thing. So the idea would be that this is our, I guess one way to say it, our real problem. Our real problem is not, for example, that I'm having an argument with somebody whose politics are different than mine. And in the reactivity thing, in the downstream model of that, would be the idea that in my anger, fury, righteousness, I need to change his mind, so I'm going to spend all my time and energy doing that. While a lot of it may be my acceptance mode and saying, that's not the problem. My problem is my non-acceptance, and I need to kind of go upstream. Clearly, people go downstream all the time. I mean, they do it all the time. As a matter of fact, probably most people do that. But if we're talking about seeing things as they really are, as being free from such things as fear, worry, and anxiety, we need to at least acknowledge that that particular system, this particular system of reactivity, will just cause more suffering. And the idea about going downstream sounds nice, but there are going to be rapids and rocks and all kinds of sort of stuff. The other thing, of course, is you don't have to step in the stream at all. You don't have to do that at all. You can kind of opt out and numb yourself, which is what a lot of people also kind of do. So, so it is really true that acceptance is part of it, but acceptance has to do with almost redefining the problem. The problem is not the person I'm angry at or the situation that I have fear about. The real problem is my anger and my fear. There they are. And swimming upstream is how I kind of see how that might go, because our natural tendency will be going with the flow, and we're just going to get wet, and nothing else much is going to happen. So, I hope that helped, Ron.
It's different ideas about that
The
river.
idea, so I guess I'm saying the idea of acceptance is almost redefining the problem. It's not the person or the situation. It is the actual location. It is in your body, what that's about. You know, what is in your body, what is in your mind when you have anger and fear. That's the real problem, not the person that you're angry and fearful about. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Somebody else? Larry, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Paul. A couple of things that you said and Jeremy said yesterday bring a bit of clarity, but also a bit of confusion. Yesterday, Jeremy talked about the middle way, and I'm wondering to a certain extent if what we're talking about here is the middle way between suffering and happiness. That both kind of act as rails to keep us on the path. But also, as you said, there's a big difference, I think, between the first arrow and the second arrow. And so when we talk about may you be free of suffering, I think there's certain kinds of suffering like birth and death and so forth that we can avoid, and there's where the acceptance is. But then there's a whole lot more with the second arrow, as you said, that really complicate and causes additional suffering that maybe we can have some influence upon. But I think sometimes we get those confused, because I think sometimes we think that if we work hard on the second arrow, we should not have any suffering from the first arrow. And I think to a certain extent, mindfulness and meditation has led people to believe that if I meditate, I will be free of all suffering. So just your thoughts on how important maybe it is to separate out these inherent sources of suffering from the more second arrow sources of suffering. Thank you.
Back to that big screen here. So thank you for that, Larry. The big thing I think to be aware of is, our root teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, is very good about this, is that unsatisfactoriness or unease is never going to go away. There's this idea about being sort of free from suffering if you practice long enough and you practice well enough, that there will be nothing that will be a problem for you. And there's clearly the idea that as you practice, that there is going to be less of that kind of reactivity. But it's always there. And I guess the thing that I would like to say, especially if you've been practicing for a while and you end up with a situation where you feel bad, you say, I must not be a very good practitioner because I've been practicing for 30 years and I should be free from suffering. Shouldn't I be free from suffering from now? Isn't that what I signed up for? And you may actually be completely free from your second arrow suffering. I mean, that would be really great. I'm not sure anybody gets to that point, but I think that we can get definitely better at our second arrow suffering. But the first arrow is always coming. The first arrow is always coming. And one of the things that I have that I think is real important to note is even if you are a completely enlightened being, you are going to have suffering. You are going to have this initial deceit. What you do with it, of course, the skill between someone who has been a deep practitioner and someone who isn't practicing is very great at that point. But they all get the first arrow. They all get the kind of the first arrow. It is interesting, the other thing you talk about, which is how this idea about these kind of aspirational things get in kind of, and they can kind of get in the way a little bit. For example, most people, and this is also in the 5 mindfulness trainings, which say that happiness is not related on external conditions. Happiness is more related to the way I am. As we sit in this pandemic and we have restrictions on our lives and fear for people around us who may get ill, we have this thought. I know it all goes that way. I'm going to be so happy when this is all over. Maybe, and maybe you won't. I mean, you'll have that initial flush that always happens. So, for example, we know that people who have wonderful things happen to them, such as winning a lottery, for example, have a big boost in happiness, but by 1 year they're back to baseline, however happy they were going to be. And it's the same sort of thing here. What we need to do on our regular daily practice is to be able to deal with what's happening in the here and now to determine our happiness. And again, since the arrows always come, we have lots of opportunity to practice, don't we? So I don't know if that answered your question, Larry, exactly, or if there's more to that. Did that help?
I'm not sure I really asked the question. So your response was fine.
Yes.
I did want to make one other comment or question, and that is, certainly we talked about the skandhas and so forth, and I think we often think about it as the sort of negative, how we can make suffering worse and so forth. But is there also a positive element to those? In other words, if we look at suffering sometimes as not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but a necessity of life, and in fact, can we have happiness without suffering? Does that in some way kind of balance this out? Keep
Yeah.
us more in the middle way.
Yes, thank you. Right. So one of the real problems here is immediately putting it into a category. Even if it's a good category, that's automatically dukkha. Is to say Vedanta, the second of the five skandhas, is dukkha. I like this, I don't like this. Because if I like this, then automatically I have this idea that when it leaves, I'll be missing it and it'll be a problem. And if I don't like it, then it's how long is it going to stay here when I don't, and I have that kind of thing. So it's almost as if you can calm that down a little bit. And I like the term child of wonder. That's curious. I have this pain in my back again. That's really curious, as opposed to, I have this pain in my back again. Why do I have this again? I went to the chiropractor. So it can, the more that we can accept and have a great deal of curiosity about it, I think the happier our lives are. So, Sue Morgan. Oh, Sue has disappeared here for a second. Sue, there you are. You're muted though. There you go. I still can't hear you, Sue. You're muted.
You were talking about unease will always be present. I have heard in the Zen teachings about enlightenment, and then when you become enlightened, you can reach a state of non-fear, and that will be permanent. So what is that so? And what is the relationship between always having unease and enlightenment?
Thank you, Sue. I think the first part is to say that there are people who are very good practitioners who, even when the first arrow of fear comes their way, they are so good at processing it that it never goes anywhere else. But as a physician, if nothing else, and a person who likes science, the idea here that fear is something that people would be able to completely get rid of is probably not true, but the idea that it could be the de facto part of that, which is fear comes upon those people, but they process it so well that you're not even aware that they have it. And certainly they have completely solved their kind of second arrow. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question? I have forgotten.
I think you answered.
Oh, thanks much.
Okay.
Paul DuPont.
Thanks, Paul. Any thoughts or guidance in terms of trying to find a middle way between acceptance of inevitable suffering that's going to be there in the world, and especially of those around us, versus complacency and not working towards justice and trying to alleviate what might be unnecessary or preventable suffering of others?
Thanks, Paul. That's a wonderful question, and I've sort of left it aside because I'm going to be talking quite a bit about that tomorrow. But let's suffice it to say that the Buddhist path is not involved with complacency and inaction. It is involved in kind of changing things as best you can, not being necessarily attached to the outcome. but changing things. So there is this idea that comes up and makes Buddhists into relatively, I don't know, bland people by having this idea that they just accept everything and kind of sit on their cushion navel gazing without doing anything about anything. I certainly think that's not true in most cases, and it's absolutely not true in the Plum Village tradition, where the idea of engaged Buddhism has been really very high on that. But the best way to actually engage your Buddhism, to be able to do things that work for things like social justice, etc., is to accept it first and kind of go with what that is. So, and of course, when we see that, and I think that most of us who have done those sorts of things, we know that when we try to do such things as sort of social justice from a place of reactivity, then we end up making lots of mistakes and lots of errors and making things worse. And if we come with our ideas about how to change the world from more openness, and we're going to talk a lot more about this through the rest of the week, then we generally do things that are more skillful. And so, but the first part is acceptance. Here it is. There it is. What can we do about that? And I'm not sure if I made this clear, and I hope I have. When I say acceptance, I mean really into the marrow of your bone. How does it feel in your body? How does it feel in your heart? Opening your heart to what's going on is an extraordinarily important thing. Think of the suffering that occurs in the world because people can't or won't open their hearts. So that's really very much part of that acceptance. So thanks,
Thanks,
Paul.
Paul. Helpful.
Jane?
What you were just talking about, about the acceptance involving opening your heart, it reminds me of well, I was going to ask you this question, but I think you kind of answered it there of saying a lot of other writers, other than Thich Nhat Hanh, talk about bringing compassion to the pain and suffering, the arrow, and not just pulling it out, but that compassion for yourself or compassion for anyone else that you see has been hurt. Is I think that's what you were saying when you're saying open your heart, that step of first, being compassionate, and that kind of takes you to the next step of being able to open your heart and do something.
Thank you, Jane. That's a really wonderful idea. And I didn't mention it as much, and I certainly will get into it the rest of the week, but one of these kind of things, this reactivity that occurs, this reactivity that keeps us going with our suffering, that is shooting the second arrow, is the ego, this me. When you start to practice, you immediately open up to other people. And that's really the most important practice, is to open up to other people. And then compassion is certainly part of that. And compassion almost becomes second nature, but compassion is extraordinarily important. It is often said in the Zen tradition that our real practice are like two wings of a bird or two strong legs that a man stands on. One is wisdom. What do we learn? How do we know? How do we know to practice? Learning things like the Four Noble Truths, etc. But the second one is compassion. The second wing of the bird, the second sturdy leg to stand on, is compassion. And I didn't mean to give that short shrift today, but when we talk about the idea of going from reactivity to openness, the other part about that would be going from self-centeredness to what we would call other-centeredness. And when I say other-centeredness, I don't mean just people, I mean the world in general. So thank you, Jane. Thanks for help clarifying that. So thank you. Mike?
Yeah, my question is similar to most of the others, and your answers have probably touched on the question two. I guess I just want to kind of clearly put out there that is there, what is there? Is there something beyond simply managing our reactivity to, to put it in oversimplified terms? Is there something that goes beyond overcoming our reactivity that, kind of leads to growth, not just in managing or eliminating the second arrow, but, makes us wiser and more compassionate and, if nothing else, in the sense of learning more about the world. Yeah, so that's my
Thanks, Mike.
question and maybe my answer too. I don't know.
Thanks, Mike. I love the statement you made about simply taking care of our reactivity, as if that's a simple thing and an easy task, but it isn't. I mean, and that's really the kind of sort of entry level thing to this. By doing this, by actually taking care of our reactivity and those particular tasks, what happens to us is we do open up to a larger world. So there are a lot of other Buddhist teachings that kind of supplement the Four Noble Truths. For example, teachings on emptiness, teachings on no self, teachings on the four Brahma Viharas, the connections of love. These are all very valuable and they support the idea of the Four Noble Truths. And absolutely those things are a great benefit not only to ourselves but to others. But the very first thing is to take care of our reactivity. If we do not take care of our reactivity, the other parts of it will be very difficult. And not to say not possible, but I have run across people who are frustrated with being able to do certain things, and you realize they haven't taken care of their reactivity. Thich Nhat Hanh was particularly bothered by some people when he came to the West, and there were people involved in the peace movement, specifically in ending the war in Vietnam. He was a little distressed by how angry and upset these people were. And he was almost like, we can't do skillful means if the people are being consumed by their anger and their hatred. And this is kind of our first step to go. So in one way, I will say that the Four Noble Truths is a complete path. If you continue to practice it, everything will go with it. On the other hand, I will say it doesn't end with just what we're talking about. If you continue to practice, the world opens up in very interesting and exciting ways. But the first idea is to practice. So thanks. Any other questions here? Cornelia?
In thinking about this, and as people practice for a long time, you can see that compassion might become the default reactivity. Mm-hmm. I know a few people in my life, and they weren't Buddhists, but they were practicing something. And it was always interesting to me that when there was a problem or some kind of trouble, that their reaction was always compassion, not defensiveness, not judgment, or chiming into the judgment of somebody who was telling something that was upsetting, but this forward going, this like a compassionate outreach, a compassionate or empathetic reactivity. And I think that it's possible with this practice to come to that point, where that becomes the new way of reacting. I've seen it a little bit in myself, and I've been sad because this current situation has gotten me to revert to a lot of judgment at times, and I'm really trying to not do this. And when this comes up, that I judge somebody over, I don't know, whether it's the mask or something else, that I stop for a moment and try to think, okay, so what is a compassionate thought on this? Or what would empathy tell me if I stop and think? And so that's just kind of my thought on this. And I'd love for compassion to be the default setting.
Thank you much, Cornelia. It is true, and we often talk about how human beings are put together so that their default setting is negativity and seeing things as fearful that are threats to your individual existence. And it's not only that Cornelia's idea that your default setting could change as you practice, but we now have functional MRI studies that indicate this, that people who basically have practiced a long time, their default setting is more one of positivity and compassion and connection rather than defending the ego and feeding fear and anger. I mean, automatically, you don't have to reach for it. Sometimes some things come by with me and I feel angry and upset, and I have to say to myself, I shouldn't be this way. And I'm going to do this swimming upstream thing to be someplace different. However, among many of the people that are practitioners, they don't even need to do that. It's just automatic. They go right to the compassionate place. So one of the other wonderful benefits of practice. So dear friends, I think we're up to about close to 11 o'clock. I just want to tell people that many of the things that you had as good questions come up in my further talks. So hopefully I will be able to continue to expand on some of that. So I'm going to end the recording now, and also we will have a 10-minute break. We come back at 11:10, and for those who wish to continue on, we'll do Dharma discussion group. And for those who are going on for the rest of the day, enjoy your journey and hope to see you back tomorrow. I take refuge in the Sangha. Thank you.